It's an airplane that was really designed in 1970, so that's a lot closer to World War II than it is today. At first blush, you would say, oh, this airplane's going away, except that it's not going away. It's actually been extremely busy.
4 airmen are recovering from minor injuries after their B-1 bomber crashed.
You would think that the B-1 is edging towards retirement. After all, it's an airplane that was really designed in 1970, so that's a lot closer to World War II than it is today. And it first entered service in 1985 and became operational in 1986. That's 40 years ago. At first blush, you would say, oh, this airplane's going away, except that it's not going away. It's actually been extremely busy. So during the period from 2001 till the conclusion of the Afghanistan war, the B-1B force was mostly conducting close air support missions, which is completely different from the Cold War strategic nuclear role that it was designed for. In the aftermath of Afghanistan, the United States refocuses its national security priorities on the Indo-Pacific area. So it's trying to support regional allies and deter the Chinese, and I guess to some extent the North Koreans too. Tactically, the air war over places like Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria was characterized by the absence of significant threats to the B-1B, either from fighters or from the ground. I mean, there were man pads and there were small arms, but the B-1B could always just avoid that by flying high enough. So it was flying in essentially benign airspace. Now, if we had a conflict with China, God forbid, that would mean that the B-1B would face highly contested and denied airspace. The B-1 was designed to penetrate air defenses, but, we're talking about air defenses of 40 years ago. If the B-1B tried to penetrate modern air defenses, as in modern 2026 air defenses, it'd probably sustain heavy losses. So the operational concept in the Indo-Pacific region has to shift from close air support to several other things. The first is long-range strike against land targets with these very stealthy standoff JASSM missiles. JASSM stands for Joint Air-to-Surface Strike Missile. The second mission would be anti-ship missions with something called LRASM. LRASM is the long-range anti-ship missile, and it's essentially an anti-ship version of the JASSM missile. And the third thing is naval mine delivery. And interestingly, the anti-shipping and naval mine delivery, using bombers for those missions harkens back to World War II. So it's almost a back to the future kind of situation. In many ways, it's almost like what, for example, RAF Coastal Command did. It may seem odd, and when until you think about it, that the Cold War strategic nuclear mission, the Middle East, Southwest Asia close air support mission, and now these Indo-Pacific missions are all accomplished by the same aircraft. But in fact, they all benefit from the same basic attributes of the B-1B, which are its long range and high speed, its large payload, and the fact that it has digital avionics, which can be reprogrammed for different missions, weapons, and threats. So there's a common base of capabilities in the B-1B that make it relevant to an extraordinarily wide range of missions. Now, there's some B-1B modernization that continues as the mission set evolves. In 2025, the U.S. Air Force awarded to Boeing a contract to fit an external load-adaptable modular, or LAM, as it's called, LAM pylons onto the B-1 Supersonic strategic bomber, which significantly improve its weapons capability. The hard points for that these external pylons go on were originally for air-launched cruise missiles, which is what the aircraft was designed to carry during the Cold War, although it actually never operationally carried them. But the hard points were there, and that for arms control reasons, they were deactivated when we had arms control treaties with the Russians. But those treaties are largely gone now, and those hard points have been reactivated. The first one that was reactivated was for the targeting pod that was used in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And then now they're going to activate the other ones and put, or some of the other ones, and they're going to put these LAM pylons on there. So the LAM pylons can not only carry the JASSM missile, but they also can carry potential hypersonic missiles. It's possible that the B-1 is going to become one of our primary platforms for hypersonic missiles, along with the B-52J, which is the re-engined version of the B-52H that's also in work. 2 years ago, the 419th Test Squadron at Edwards Air Force Base, which is actually my old squadron from 40 years ago, tested a prototype of LAM on the B-1B. Now, you referred to several losses of the aircraft, and there have been some losses. On April 20th, 2022, tail number 85-0089 was undergoing some maintenance. It was on the ground, and it experienced a catastrophic engine failure and a fire. So what happened was that a fan disc in one of the engines disintegrated, and the debris sprayed out all over the place, and it severed a fuel line. And, you get fuel line on hot metal, and you can draw the rest of the picture. One airman suffered minor injuries, fortunately no more than that, but the airplane was a write-off. So they pulled another one, 85-0081, out of the boneyard, AMARC, at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Tucson, Arizona, and that airplane is going to be the replacement. So that was the first of the two losses. The other loss was on January 4th, 2024. Tail number 85-0085 was doing an instrument approach to Ellsworth Air Force Base in South Dakota, and it landed short of the runway. So it skidded across the ground, and then it caught fire, and the airplane was destroyed. Fortunately, the crew got out. So, count your blessing. The mishap board came down pretty hard on this one. They identified pilot error. There was some lack of awareness of airfield conditions that may have been accelerated by some stuff happening at the airfield. They criticized poor supervision and an organizational culture. Now, outside critics have come down very hard on the Air Force and the fact that the Air Force, they believe, has some pretty systematic problems that also contributed to this, that the Air Force is overstretched. So this wasn't a good scene. And we lost an airplane, but fortunately we didn't lose any people.
So some of the criticisms for that just sort of come out of decades of high-intensity operations and then a drawdown with a high level of readiness still required post-Afghanistan.
Yeah, I think that's the kind of things that we've heard. It was not a good thing. And of course, they aren't making new B-1s. So every time we lose one, that's it. The airplane also has a large number of sustainability issues, which is not surprising considering that you're talking about airplanes that were built 40 years ago. So in 2021, they retired 17 airplanes to AMARC at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. And those were the airplanes that were evaluated to be the ones that would require the most investment to maintain their airworthiness. Of the 17, 4 were kept in a condition that they could be regenerated as airframes, and the 2 of them have already been pulled out of the boneyard, and that leaves 2 left that we could potentially pull out of the boneyard. Now, the other 13 are basically going to be a source of parts to keep the remaining ones flying, which brings up the issue of diminishing stock of spare parts. It's not just you can't just go out and buy. People say, well, we'll go out and buy them. Well, you can't just buy things for the B-1. They're not exactly off the shelf. In fact, in a lot of cases, if you go back to the original manufacturer, yes, the airplane was built by Rockwell, which is now Boeing, but it's not actually like Rockwell built the whole airplane. They buy stuff from everywhere. So in many cases, if you go back to the original manufacturer, that original manufacturer might not even be in business anymore. Or they may have been so acquired and merged and all that essentially they've changed out of recognition. Even if you can go back, the tooling and test equipment often aren't available. They weren't saved. And people would say, well, you should have saved it. Well, that stuff takes time. That stuff takes money to store stuff. And at some point, if the government isn't willing to pay for it, then companies at some point will say, well, we're not going to keep this stuff anymore. The subject matter experts on the parts are all retired at this point. I mean, there's almost no one still working who worked on this thing 40 years ago. For example, you look for electronic parts, you'll find that the parts aren't even being manufactured anymore. So if you want to go back to a company and say, we want this, let's say, system, because we're running out of them, here's what happens. You need to redesign the assemblies for the parts and materials that are available today. And then you need to rebuild the tooling and test equipment. And then you need to, after you've built these, you need to redo the functional environmental qualification testing because you need to make sure that they work in hot, cold, and vibration, electromagnetic interference, humidity, all the different environments that something has to work. So by the time you're done with that for an assembly, you can be at $10 million or more, and you're talking about 3 to 4 years. So running out of stuff is not just a question of buying it. It's a question of re-engineering it. And it's tantamount in some cases to almost starting from scratch. Then you have the issue of fatigue. You have these airframes that have been around for 40 years. They don't necessarily have a ton of hours on them. It's not like they're an airliner where they fly 8 or 12 hours a day. For much of their life, they did low-level flying, and that's pretty rough on an airframe. And then they've just been flying around a lot. Remember, a Strategic Air Command airplane was basically designed to sit on alert. Well, these airplanes have been, in the Middle East flying close air support missions and just flying again and again and again and doing a ton of air refueling, and they've really accumulated fatigue. One of the pieces that seems to be most affected by fatigue is something called the forward intermediate fuselage, which is a 33-foot component in the aircraft's upper spine section forward of the wings. They have a program to replace that called the Backbone Project. So you're going to be seeing major structural work on these old airplanes. One of the interesting technological things about this forward intermediate fuselage replacement is that they're doing something called a digital twin. Since early 2020, and in fact, I talked about this a little bit in the book, the National Institute of Aviation Research, which is in Wichita, Kansas, has been meticulously building a digital replica of the B-1, disassembling and scanning 2 retired B-1s to create a high-fidelity 3D model, and that's supporting future repair. So, you see retired parts of the fleet supporting the 45 or so airplanes that are remaining. Should have been 45. I don't know with the 2 attrition whether the fleet is actually back up to 45 or whether it's, I think, at 44 at this point. Then there's a really big issue that has been popping up, which is the airplane, particularly for these Asia-Pacific scenarios, is dependent on having these long-range missiles. And the long-range missiles are very expensive. We didn't buy that many of them. We might buy a few hundred a year. Well, we've been firing off these things a few hundred every day or something like that over Iran. So we may not have, and this is, of course, very classified, but it may be that the United States actually doesn't have very many JASSM missiles left. And that's pretty bad. We need to rebuild the inventory as soon as possible, and you can't do it as soon as possible because these things take a lot of time. It's not so much the final assembly and checkout at the prime contractor, which for the JASSM I believe is Lockheed Martin. That needs to be expanded, but that isn't the holdup. The real holdup is further down in the supply chain. It could be engines, it could be actuators, it could be warheads. I mean, there are dozens of subassemblies that go into a JASSM missile, and each of them in turn have hundreds of parts potentially. So, you're down to, there could be several hundred companies involved, and all of them have to be there because if you don't have one part, you can't build your JASSM missile. So B-1s without these JASSM missiles are cool-looking airshow airplanes, but they're not very effective weapon systems. And we have a screaming need for more munitions. Of course, it's not just the JASSM. I mean, if you look across the inventory, it's everything we're short of at this point. The United States has a major need to build up its stocks of munitions, because what we've been doing is firing very expensive things against very cheap drones. And we do that because of what we're protecting, but the economics of that are not great.
The Pima Air and Space Museum in Tucson, Arizona is home to one of the largest non-government funded aviation and space museums in the world. Featuring nearly 400 aircraft, the museum is home to an incredible collection like NASA's NB-52 X-15 dropship and 747 SP Sophia Airborne Observatory, to a wealth of rare military types from air forces all around the world, to the first production 777 and the second prototype 787 Dreamliner. Whether you're a military or civilian aviation geek, there will be an incredible aircraft around every corner of this epic 80-acre site for you to explore. As the Aviation Show's partnership with the Pima Air and Space Museum enters its 3rd year, we're delighted to say that Pima is truly a top of your bucket list museum to visit. And it keeps getting better because the Philippine Mars is now on display, and right across the car park, the Tucson Military Vehicle Museum's doors are wide open to welcome you in to check out an amazing collection of tanks, armored fighting vehicles, and other vehicles, if you get fed up with all the airplanes. To find out more about the incredible collection and the fantastic events coming up at the Pima Air and Space Museum, and of course the Tucson Military Vehicle Museum, head over to www.pimaair.org to plan your trip to one of the world's great aviation collections, and one that now includes tanks next door, if that's your sort of thing. So we're in an interesting position where an aircraft, the last time we spoke, we were thinking again about retirement, is actually continuing in its service, being upgraded, but its munitions are the things that are probably going to be holding it back in the near term.
I think that's the case. I mean, the government is being very coy about this, but I think that it doesn't take a huge stretch of the imagination to realize that, when you're firing off hundreds of these things and the amount that we've bought over the last over the last decade or plus has been like several thousand, we could be running through those stocks very, very quickly, which gets us to the issue of operation. The B-1 has been seeing a lot of combat. When we last talked, the idea was that the United States would be shifting its national security strategy particularly from the Middle East to the Indo-Pacific region. And that still is some area of concern, but in fact, the B-1B has seen combat elsewhere. The first time more recently that it did that was February 2nd, 2024, in the aftermath of the Hamas attack on Israel, and then in October 7th, 2023, and then a day later, Hezbollah attacked. And those are, of course, both Iranian proxy forces. There were, in general, increases in violence around the region, and Iranian proxy forces in Iraq and Syria killed 3 American soldiers. So we did a retaliatory raid against some of those proxy forces in Iraq and Syria. It was 2 B-1B bombers. They flew out of Dyess Air Force Base. They went to the target nonstop, air-refueled, but nonstop, and then returned to Dyess Air Force Base, nonstop, 18 hours of flight time. The government has been very, very coy about giving out operational details on what's going on, obviously, other than the very high-level stuff. So I don't know whether B-1s were used against the Houthi militia, or whatever you want to call them, in Yemen. I mean, I know that B-2s, I believe, were used, but I don't know whether B-1s were. It's certainly not beyond the realm of possibility that they were. We do know that B-1s were used in January of this year, 2026, in this raid called Operation Absolute Resolve, which was the raid in Venezuela where they captured this guy Maduro, who was the president. And again, we don't know exactly what the B-1s did, but we do know that there were B-1s there, both there and in leading up to that. Then, of course, the big one has been Operation Epic Fury in Iran, where the United States and Israel have been attacking various capabilities of the regime and the IRGC. There have been a lot of B-1 attacks there. We don't have too much detail. We do know, I think, that there have been some B-1s based out of the UK. Now, there may also have been B-1s that have been coming straight from the continental United States. And we don't know where else there have been B-1s coming from. I don't think that there's been indication that there have been B-1s based in Israel. However, we do know that there are tankers based in Israel, and potentially B-1s flying from elsewhere could be using those tankers. So there's certainly been no shortage of B-1 attacks as part of this. Again, the virtues that the B-1 gives of long range, high payload, of the adaptability of its digital software-driven systems, make it a very useful asset. The most recent use of the B-1 was that it's been announced that 4 B-1s participated in the successful combat search and rescue of the crew of an F-15E that was shot down. That was a call sign Dude 44. And the pilot was picked up pretty quickly. The weapons system officer was injured and had to hide out for, I think, the better part of 2 days until he was recovered. And there was a massive operation, which, again, the government's very coy about, but seems to have included various attacks to tie down enemy forces that may have tried to get this guy, and perhaps some diversionary attacks to keep attention away from where we were actually trying to pick this guy up. And somehow or another, the B-1 was involved in that. Again, there's really no details. For a small fleet of aging aircraft, it's been very involved in the sorts of things that it's been asked to do, which leads to the question of what's the future for the B-1? And then there's the endless sustainment issues. You've got to keep this going. I had an interesting experience in my job before I retired. I worked for one of the major aerospace suppliers, and we built a significant system on the B-1, and the government came to our company and said, we need a certain part for the B-1. And my boss knew that I was the B-1 guy, so he came to me and said, Ken, you take care of this. So I did some research on what we had, which involved going through 40 some odd year old drawings and documentation. And what I found was that we had last delivered these parts to the B-1 program in 1988, which is not surprising because that's when the last B-1 was built. And I tried to figure out what this part was and how we made it, and discussed that with several of my colleagues. And it turned out that the part that they were looking for is something that we used to make in-house. And then we decided at some point that we didn't want to make these in-house because there were companies that specialized in these things, and so we would buy them from other people. And so, I mean, I guess you say we can't make it. I mean, with enough time and effort, we could probably make most anything, but it would be ridiculous to try to do that. And the customer, the military, wouldn't be interested in paying us to do it, and we wouldn't be that interested in doing it. So in that case, we always will give all the specs and everything to the government so that they can find it. In fact, what we did was we gave the government the names of the companies, the vendors that we would go to if we wanted to buy those parts today. And the recommendation was that either those companies probably have something off the shelf that will serve the purpose, or could probably make something using their processes and materials that they have that would be a suitable replacement for the thing that they wanted to get from us. I haven't heard since, but I assume that they took us up on our advice. You know, that's never simple, because even if you have, let's say you have something and it works great, and then you go to somebody else and say, well, what do you have that basically will fit? And you look at the specs and this and that, and yeah, it looks good. The problem is that what might appear to be the same when you look at materials and parts and processes doesn't always work out to be exactly the same. Physical things have a certain variation. They can be, sometimes they have, for example, they take longer to, if it's an electronic component, they take longer to do something. The rise times are different or something like that. And so what you'll sometimes find is that something that's supposedly a replacement, for most of the time is a replacement, but 10% of them are slightly out of tolerance. And when those tolerances stack up, the next higher assembly doesn't work properly. Or you'll find out that, yeah, the electronic part is functionally the same, but the footprint of the leads coming off of it onto the printed wiring board are different. All of which is a very long-winded way of saying that sustaining these things is quite a complex engineering task. And that's, of course, something that's going to be very prominent in the B-1 program till the day it retires. In the medium term, you've got this forward intermediate fuselage repair, and that's a very big, elaborate, expensive repair on an old airplane. You probably wouldn't do a replacement like this on your car. Unless it was some sort of really, valuable vintage car. But airplanes are a little bit different than cars in that way. There's going to be limited modernization. Now, the Air Force knows they're going to retire the B-1, so they don't want to see how much money they can put in there. And on the other hand, it's what we got. So, for example, you have these LAM pylons that I talked about. That looks like that's going to happen. And then you've got hypersonic missiles potentially. And if you're going to have hypersonic missiles, you have to develop the missiles, and then you have to integrate them with the airplane. Integrating them with the airplane is a fairly elaborate process and involves making sure they fit. It has to do with the separation and jettison characteristics of the missile, which is aerodynamics. It has to do with the software and hardware interfaces between the missile and the aircraft. You have to modify the software inside the aircraft avionics systems to control the missile and launch it. Now, all that stuff can be done, and in fact, the B-1's got pretty new avionics on it. So, that's a question of writing software, but writing software takes time, particularly aviation quality software and weapon system quality software, because it'd be a real bummer if, there was a software bug and you launched a hypersonic missile by accident. So first of all, the engineering challenge of developing and testing a new missile and then putting it into production. But there's a parallel effort of integrating the missile with an airplane. And that's a big deal. And so that's something that'll be happening. So the B-1 test people out at Edwards Air Force Base, the operational test people at Dyess Air Force Base will be busy with this for the indefinite future. And then we've got to rebuild stocks of these missiles so that we've been expending, particularly over Iran. That is a screaming priority, because if we don't do that, then the airplane really isn't all that useful. So there's a lot of work in the meantime on the airplane. The B-1B eventually is going to be replaced by the Northrop Grumman B-21 Raider. The first operational base for the B-21 will be Ellsworth Air Force Base in South Dakota. That's currently the home of the 28th Bomb Wing, which flies the B-1B. Presumably what's going to happen is that when the B-21 replaces the B-1B at Ellsworth, that's going to free up 2 squadrons of airplanes. I suspect what they'll do is that they'll take a look at the holistically at the whole fleet, and they'll say, which airplanes do we want to retire to staff the remaining ones down at Dyess Air Force Base? So there may be some airplanes at Ellsworth that go to Dyess, and some at Dyess that get retired, and then some from Ellsworth that get retired. So you skinny down as you remove the first 2 squadrons. And then that will be more airplanes that can be cannibalized for parts to keep the remaining ones going. Then eventually the B-21 is supposed to replace the rest of the B-1Bs and also the B-2s, but that depends on the pace of B-21 testing and production, which the Air Force has been extremely tight-lipped about. Do we have a decade left of the B-1? Probably. I don't think that's beyond the pale, plus or minus a few years. For an airplane that is quite old, there seems to be an awful lot doing.
And for an aircraft that had such an inauspicious start, it's had an incredible service over the last 40 years and will be pushing 50 by the time the drawdown starts apace.
Yeah, it's very interesting how it's been successful in doing things that it just never was intended to do. And again, I go back to the fact that it has some qualities that make it valuable and seem to be kind of timeless and support many different roles. The ones of long range and high speed, the large payload, and then this digital avionics system, which has been, updated several times. But the fact that the airplane essentially can be reprogrammed for different missions, different weapons, different threats, that just has made it a very flexible airplane.
Thank you for coming back and joining us, Ken. The book stands up still. Thank you so much for writing it. Do you want to give us just a shout out for what it's called?
The book is called The Supersonic BONE, A Development and Operational History of the B-1 Bomber. It's published by Pen and Sword in the United Kingdom. And in fact, a paperback version of the book just came out. So it's in its 3rd printing in the paperback version.
I'm surprised it's only been 3 printings, because this aircraft is wildly popular and your book is superb. So
thank you.
Thank you so much, Ken.